Good morning, and welcome to the 2019 winter meeting in our nation's capital. To my colleagues and our visitors who are joining us today, it's certainly an honor to serve as chair of the National Governors Association. We're going to have some new faces in the room over these next couple days. I recognize many of them are still coming in from breakfast. Many of the 22 new governors who took office this year will be in attendance throughout the weekend. It's one of the largest classes of new governors ever before. And I have no doubt that they will bring that same spirit of bipartisanship and camaraderie, and a willingness to engage in thoughtful discussion, even if we don't necessarily agree on every issue, with their fellow governors from across the country. Governor Hogan, as vice chair, and I have become strong partners in working with governors all across the nation to tackle some of the most pressing issues facing our states. And one of the issues that we know that almost every governor faces is how we're playing a constructive role in ensuring that every American has a good job that they can be proud of. We're in the midst of profound economic and social transformations, certainly characterized by technological disruption, global forces, a changing workforce, and decades of middle-class stagnation. I often say I had regular access to the governor's house as a kid, but it's because I delivered newspapers to it. I was raised in a single-parent household, paycheck to paycheck. We went from doing that to now raising our 3 kids in the governor's residence. So I've only made it 4 blocks in life. But if I think about when I was a kid growing up, 90% of 30-year-olds were doing better than their parents were at age 30. Today, only half of 30-year-olds are doing better than their parents. 44% of Americans, if they had an emergency that they needed $400, they wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity to even have that $400. From 1935 to 1960, the standard of living doubled. From 1960 to 1985, the standard of living doubled again, and since then, it's laid flat. We can despair, or ultimately we can look forward. And I'm optimistic. We're about halfway through my chair's initiative, Good Jobs for All Americans. We've been holding a series of regional workshops, heard from dozens of policy leaders that have come from over half of the states across the country. We've heard time and time again that we can shape technological and economic transformation rather than having it shape us. By actively working with businesses, educators, workers, and others, we can ensure that the future of work is even brighter than the present of work. And by rethinking education and workforce training, by reimagining what the social contract in 2019 requires between the public sector and the private sector, we can create opportunity where seemingly no opportunity exists. If I've learned anything through this initiative, it's that there's a greater need for leadership from the governors than ever before. Americans know that these changes are already at our doorstep. When surveyed, 72% of working adults will tell you that they feel the need to get more education and training. Yet here in the U.S., we invest less in education for adults than nearly any other advanced economy. We've heard loud and clear that we need to equip today's workers with new skills. We've identified the need for a lifelong system of learning in our country that meets people where they are and gives them the education and new skills that they need. Nonetheless, we spend about $122 billion a year at the federal level when it comes to investments in higher education, and only $9.5 billion a year when it comes to workforce training. We've identified the pressing need for employers to hire workers based on skills and competencies, not just degrees. And we've identified the need for those employers to be investing in their employees over the long term. And we've heard that how many employers are struggling with these same issues and how we can challenge them to do more. A recent study by the World Economic Forum estimates that as many as 1.4 million workers may be displaced by technology in the next decade, and that the cost of retraining those workers for new jobs could be as much as $34 billion. The cost of not retraining them, however, it's incalculably higher, both in social and in economic terms. The private sector must do more to provide good jobs and pathways for workers, but they certainly can't do it alone. As governors, we're well positioned to bring together employers, educators, and workers to build a new infrastructure for the jobs of the future. And we have to figure out a way to ensure that businesses are as incentivized to invest in their workers as they are into equipment. Finally, we've heard how rural communities are working to redefine and reimagine themselves, and how state policies can support a stronger rural ecosystem that empowers local entrepreneurs and civic leaders. Between 2005 and 2015, there were 150,000 new businesses started and created in the United States. 2/3 of our counties, though, in the nation actually lost businesses during that time. Only 1/3 gained both the 150 and all the losses. We know that we have to do much more in bridging that urban-rural divide, because if part of America is falling behind, all of America is falling behind. We've learned a lot through this initiative, but we still have a long way to go. I remain confident that we have the tools we need to expand upward mobility, safeguard economic opportunity for current and future workers. Certainly look forward to working with all of the governors in the coming months and all of you. We put together a short video with highlights from the current effort and workshops to date.
The pay makes a good job. Of course, salary, work environment, all the conditions, benefits, of course.
A good job would be something that you can express yourself unabashedly and get rewarded from it, not only fiscally, but emotionally as well.
I guess a good job is just something where you're feeling fulfilled, and I mean, if you can make some good money with it and support your family, that's a great thing too. But I think that it's more important to be happy where you're spending 40 or 50 hours a week than making, $200,000 a year.
I want a job that really gives to the community more than it gives to anything else. It's maybe I would be an environmental worker or veterinarian, something that actually gives instead of you just taking.
Governors are uniquely positioned to really bring together the different facets of our overall workforce system, from private employers to our educational system to state government to higher ed. We're not getting enough skills to individuals, even for today's workforce. Re-engaging workers and saying, do we need to upskill or change the skills that you have, or how do we better apply the skills that you already have and make sure that those are recognized? And we need to focus on that urban-rural disconnect at times and make sure that our rural areas have the economic opportunities and job-creating opportunities. Because if we leave one part of the country behind, the whole country goes down a little bit in that respect.
We believe that the fundamental promise in America, the covenant that we have with one another, is fundamentally broken right now. The promise that if you work hard and you set high goals, that you can provide for yourself and for your family and for your community.
We have dedicated resources to really going out, engaging those employers to say, how can we help you connect with education that's in your local area?
And I tell people all the time, particularly when I talk to younger people, that when I was their age, there are certain technologies and devices that are available now were not imagined. And so it's making sure that they understand that they're preparing for a future that they cannot really imagine.
And the end game of this process, the Good Jobs for All Americans initiative, is really to be able to give to all of our governors more or less a toolkit. Here are some of the best practices. One of the best things that governors can do is take from the best practices from other states. We learn from these laboratories of democracy the best way to bring things forward.
So we've assembled a great panel today to kick off and talk about many of the facets of creating good jobs for all Americans. Secretary Penny Pritzker is an entrepreneur, a civic leader, philanthropist with a wide array of public and private experiences, including Secretary of Commerce, where she led the first ever skilled workforce initiative at the department. She was co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations Independent Task Force, which recently issued their report. It's called The Work Ahead: Machine Skills and U.S. Leadership in the 21st Century. We're so pleased you could join us today, Secretary.
Thank you, Governor.
Now, Richard Haas, right next, certainly needs no introduction, but for anybody who hasn't had a chance to work with him, he's an American diplomat, an academic, has been president of the Council of Foreign Relations since 2003, served as Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. Department of State, been a close advisor to former Secretary of State Colin Powell, has a long history of service to our nation's diplomatic corps. And for the last 4 years, Deborah and James Fallows have been traveling through rural America reporting on innovation of all kinds. Their national best-selling book on the project, Our Town's 100,000-Mile Journey into the Heart of America, was published in May. James is a longtime correspondent for The Atlantic magazine, written 12 books, won a National Book Award, worked for 2 years in the White House as President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter and as founding chairman of New America. Deborah is a writer and a linguist. She's written extensively on language, education, families, and work, China, and travel for The Atlantic, National Geographic, Slate, the New York Times, and Washington Monthly. James, Deborah, Richard, and Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Please give them a round of applause. Secretary Pritzker, I'll open it up with you as the co-chair of the Council of Foreign Relations Task Force. And this is something that when I read, I knew that we had to have you speaking to our overall crew. I know that you and your team came up with a series of recommendations along the way of how we can better link workforce and education. Could you give us a sense of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us here today. Governor, I think the fact that you've made good jobs for all Americans a centerpiece of what you're doing at the NGA is really terrific. Because we all know that the people in our communities are being affected by these seismic forces of innovation, automation, artificial intelligence, and globalization, and that also that the nature of work is changing. What the report is, and there's a slide deck that we put together for you, governors, is really a menu of opportunities for you to consider policies to implement in your states. Because you as governors sit at the fulcrum point of being able to actually change the opportunity set for the people in your states. And let me just give you a couple of examples of some of the recommendations. First is to begin with a review in your state, which you've done, Governor, in Montana, of what are the skills gaps that exist? What's the difference between what your business community needs and what is your community colleges, your universities, your high schools offering in terms of training? And that gap analysis is really critical to beginning to set out what's the work plan to address the challenge. And there's companies both in the book and in the handout that we've given you, we've listed here's who you can go to who will help you do that assessment, whether it's LinkedIn or Burning Glass or EMSI, they'll help your states do this assessment. And they'll give you the data, because you have to start with the best possible data about what are your jobs needs and also what are your community colleges and other training organizations offering. I think second is really recognizing that the community colleges are your leverage point. These institutions are so vital to so many in our communities, particularly those who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, as well as those who are mid-career and need retraining. And there are organizations that can help you align, what's going on in your community colleges with what's happening, what your businesses need. Again, you as governors are the people who can bring together your educational institutions, your businesses, your NGOs that provide mentorship to address these issues. So there's organizations like Pathways to Prosperity, which I think is out here. They've got a kiosk here, or Skillful, that are working with different governors to make sure that your credentialing system is something that's both relevant but also is stackable and valuable to the worker. And then and I'll put in a shameless plug for Select USA here, which is an organization that I helped found when I was Secretary of Commerce. You want to go out and leverage your workforce investment to bring in new employers. Every governor is a salesperson out selling your state, right? And what Select USA is helping with foreign direct investment. But you've got to go out and say, here, I've got this workforce investment. I have the supply chain that can help support you as a company in your endeavors. And I would suggest one thing is, and our report does, you want a point person in your organization as governor that can quarterback in your administration on workforce and on education and on economic development, because bringing all those disparate parts of your government together to work and be aligned and coordinating the interagency is really tough. Finally, I would just say that our report throws out some really interesting ideas that are being tried by different states. And as I said, the report's really a menu of options. But for example, lifelong learning accounts. Washington State has a pilot going on where they're experimenting with tax advantage accounts where both an employee and employer can set aside money for training. Or Connecticut, Georgia, Virginia, Rhode Island, Kentucky, Mississippi all have a program where they're basically providing worker training tax credits. That's another option available to you. And finally, there's the question of, would you maybe have state-run automatic and individual retirement accounts? Because one of the problems is people are not getting benefits from their some of their jobs, particularly in the gig economy. Anyway, the point of the report, and that's a really fast summary, is there's lots of options, and it's very much targeted to you as governors. And it's something that is meant to be a useful tool for you and your staffs. Obviously, you'll learn from each other. And finally, we put our contact information at the back of it so that the resources that the Council on Foreign Relations made available to develop this menu can be made available to you or your staff or whoever would like to learn more.
And there are so many things in that report that's kind of transformational in the way that we all need to begin to think. Like I started a future-ready workforce for Montana, just dealing with a cabinet. I mean, a sub-cabinet, and bringing in education and bringing everybody to take a peek at where that can go. And other things like that we need to be doing.
Exactly.
You are not always the most optimistic human being, it seems, Richard, but with regard to the ongoing debate about automation, you do provide, on the one hand, what I'd say is an optimistic view that we're unlikely to face mass unemployment, but you also give us the warning that while technologies can increase the productivity and our quality of life, they only lift all boats if the gains are equally distributed. So how do we make sure that in a changing world that millions of Americans aren't left behind by these changes?
Well, it's the right question, it's the right issue, and you're all to be commended for focusing on it. It's the reason that we had this task force, which Secretary Pritzker co-chaired. The stakes here are enormous. We're already seeing signs in the United States, and look at Western Europe, of large amounts of populism. You ain't seen nothing yet. The amount of jobs that will be destroyed by the new technologies will be great. And while the new technologies will create a lot of jobs at the same time, the mismatch between the skill levels the jobs require and the skill levels our existing workforce has, that mismatch is large. And unless we close that gap, we are going to have, I think, massive social problems, and we are not going to even have anything like the bandwidth we need to deal with the foreign policy issues that I believe we need to deal with. What I think is going to make this really hard is it's only going to hit us gradually. The more I look at public policy, the most difficult group of policies to deal with are what I would call slow motion crises, because they happen gradually. And until they really hit, it's very hard to galvanize the sense of urgency you need, the resource allocation you need. But by the time they hit, it's too late. Most of the good options have gone, and that'll be true with climate. It'll be true with this. It'll be true with dealing with debt, you name it. So I think the fact that you're addressing it now is exactly right. But I think you also have to make the case for it, because it's not necessarily obvious to everybody in the society. But by the time it's obvious, again, it's too late. I would just say most of the work, and Penny Pritzker laid it out, is going to have to be in 3 areas. One is education. We can talk about that more. But a real menu of education, and it's probably, I still think the most basic, besides all the life learning approaches and flexibility, will be foundational. It's really glib to say someone's 48 years old, he or she is just out of a job because the job disappeared, we're just going to re-educate and retrain them. Unless they've got a strong educational foundation, that is not going to be easy. So looking at what we do in K through 12 and the rest, I still think is essential. Secondly, one thing you can do uniquely as governors is to make it easier to move from state to state and do the same thing without having to get re-credentialed. You have control over that. It is absurd that people in the business of hairdressing and the rest can't simply take their talents and do it in all 50 states. Obviously, other fields like teaching a little bit more, its own politics, but that is something that is in the power of this group to resolve. That's not a Washington issue, that's an NGA issue. I would make that a priority, because you could do that with and essentially for one another and for yourselves. And lastly, and this gets at and I heard the phrase already, the laboratories of democracy theme. In terms of portability of benefits, safety nets, increasingly we are going to have to separate so much of our safety nets from quasi-permanent full-time jobs. We're going to have to assume that we have a society where people have 10 to 20 jobs in the course of their career. Some of these are going to be full-time, some of these are going to be part-time. And we need to create a society that allows people to have that degree of mobility. And again, the innovation is going to happen, I think, at the state and city level much more than it's going to happen at the Washington level.
Thanks, Richard. And I mean, a lot there. I mean, interesting even on one point. I think in 1950, 5% of jobs needed a state license. Today, it's 29%, and it's often state by state through our licensing boards, for sure. Deborah and James, you traveled all across America. You didn't spend enough time in Montana.
Not yet.
Come back on that. But you were collecting stories for the book. And the book, as I said, it's Our Town's 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. But in that, you highlight innovation as the hallmark of many of the communities that you saw. What were some of the most startling or intriguing stories of innovation that you saw while on the ground?
I'll give one or two, and then Deb will have another two. First, I'll say it's such an honor to be here with the NGA, because the main theme of our reports in this book is that mayors and governors are the people who are getting things done in the country now. So we're really glad to have this chance to talk with you. Our main focus, in addition to the workforce issues that you've just heard about, which we agree on, has been on communities, the way that smaller communities are able to revive their economies, attract people back there, revive businesses that might have been overtaken by technology. And there were 3 themes we saw there. I'll mention briefly, then 1 or 2 examples. One is to remember how acutely place-conscious Americans still are. People who are from West Virginia will always be from West Virginia in their minds. People from the South are from the South. People from Montana are from Montana. And there's a tremendous reservoir of a mental hold on people who might have grown up in some place, moved away from a small town in South Dakota, worked in Chicago or San Francisco, but have in mind the idea of going back there sometime, some connection there. That is stronger than you would think. A second thing we found in communities that were able to get economic prospects is a very acute awareness of their own particular local strengths and weaknesses. That places in the agricultural regions knew that some kind of farm technology was their chance. Places in scenic regions knew that tourism was a better opportunity. So knowing clearly the strengths and weaknesses of each community by community setting was important. The other was these communities seemed to take a long incremental view. They weren't going to solve their problems in 6 months or in 1 year, but they had 5 or 10 year plans, and if they could measure some progress along the way, then they could do something. Just to give you 2 or 3 examples of the kinds of places we're talking about, and then Deb will describe one a little more. Eastport, Maine is a place right on the Bay of Fundy that has lost its sardine canning business, but they've been extremely innovative at having new port business and having renewable energy from the Bay of Fundy. Spearville, Kansas, they've augmented their traditional wheat growing business with wind turbines, which are now providing all kinds of revenue to the town. Many parts of West Virginia, which have all the problems we're familiar with, recognize they have scenic assets, which are among the rare ones in the country. And if Vermont and Montana and Colorado and Wyoming can make themselves resort destinations, West Virginia thinks it can too. Fresno, California, in the agricultural region, not a small area, but sort of a traditionally hard-pressed one, is becoming a center of advanced agricultural technology. Duluth, Minnesota, which had a long rise and then decline, is now a manufacturing and tourist destination too. Across the country, we saw these examples of cities, regions, and working with our governors to say, we can figure out an innovative approach for our community. We can match the talent we have here to opportunities we can create, and we can have a growing area. And our book, its main point is to have examples from much of the country, not yet Montana. Will be there in the next leg. But Deb will give you one more illustration.
I'd like to talk about a town where we spend a lot of time. It's called Ajo in Arizona, in southwest Arizona. It's a very tiny town, only 3,000 people, and it's extremely remote. It's 40 miles from the next town, which is Gila Bend, 80 miles from the nearest hospital, 120 miles from a rental car agency in Phoenix. Ajo was a thriving community through much of the 20th century because of its copper mine, the biggest copper mine that led this as deep as this Empire State Building is tall. The mine failed in about 1985, and then the town started going downhill until about a dozen years later, a group of citizens got together and said, we need to save this town. And they came from the 3 main ethnic groups that had supported the mining town through its entire existence: the Tohono O'odham tribe from the native reservation, the Mexicans from just across the border who lived in Ajo the whole time, and the Anglos. And they decided on a dramatic 3-part turnaround for this town. It was based on a man-made asset that they had, which was the old Company Town School, which they turned around the idea was to turn around it into a conference center and make it a permanent revenue stream. They trained the unemployed in Ajo of all ages with apprenticeships to do the kinds of jobs it took to make that: plumbing, electricians, carpentry, painters, all skilled jobs that led to certification in those jobs. And once the conference center was built, they knew that they could continue to have jobs in that town in restoring the housing stock and maintaining the public buildings in that town. There were 2 other additional efforts. One was in agriculture and food. It is a rough place to grow food. It's the middle of the Sonoran Desert. It's hot, it's cold, it has no rainfall, and the clay soil is not conducive to good crop growing. On the other hand, the Tohono O'odham tribe had been living there for centuries and centuries and knew how to grow crops there. So they helped the other people in the town figure out what kind of agriculture would work, and they spread this effort throughout the town. The school has gardens, the clinic has gardens, all the homes have gardens, a restaurant have gardens, and they turned that into a big piece of the tourist industry, where people would come by and go to the restaurants and have this other kind of food. The third thing that they did was lean towards something that the town had always developed, which is being an artistic community. Everyone loves the light in Ajo, and everyone is an artist of some sort. So at the conference center, they provided subsidized housing for artists to kind of instigate and instill this sense of how important the arts could be in a community. And the people in the town were artists of their own nature, and they made the town beautiful as another draw for not only tourists to be there, but it's a better place for themselves to be there. Those three things worked to turn this town around. And the last time we were there, they were having conferences in the conference center and weddings in the conference center. Part of the secret, if there's a secret sauce in this, is that at the very beginning, they knew how to work the system of finding grants at all levels, from the states and from the national government, to jumpstart this effort and really get it all going.
Deborah, one of the things you mentioned about AHO when they were coming together was apprenticeships and work-based learning. And there's over 1,000 different apprenticeable fields. We started 21 of them in healthcare alone just in the last few years. But also one thing that we had in Montana is we have 85 microbreweries. We have microbreweries in a town of 400, but we couldn't find enough brewers, so we started an apprenticeship in microbrewing. Now, one of your conclusions in your book is you got a microbrewery in town, you have vitality. Now, why? What made you think that, or is it just that you like good beer?
So, well, at the end of the book, we have 10 and a half signs of civic success. The 10 of them are worthy points. The 1/2 is having a microbrewery. And so the reason it's there, partly we love beer, partly it's a proxy for having a certain kind of entrepreneurial class, a certain kind of customer class. It's ways to develop downtowns. You can get like the arts movement. Also, I worked, as the governor mentioned long ago, for President Carter as a speechwriter in the White House. One of his great and underappreciated achievements was deregulating home brewing. Jimmy Carter is the father of the craft brew revolution in the United States.
And is that where Billy Beer came from back then? Secretary Pritzker, every governor ultimately does want to make sure that we're providing sort of the good opportunities and good job opportunities for the residents of our states. And we know that an educated and skilled workforce is a critical factor then in attracting and creating those good jobs. A lot of new and exciting initiatives, certainly linking workforce needs and education, taking place across the country. What's the economic payoff for states to do this well, and what really should be the public role, and what's the role of businesses?
Well, there's a big economic payoff, I think, and I think this question of what is the public role, what is the private role, is really important. And if there's just one concept, I would say you come away with partnership. What Jim and Deborah pointed out in their stories is that each state, and in fact, regions of states, are different. I mean, if you look at downstate Illinois versus Chicago, there's a lot of difference there. We're both a big city, have a big city, and we have very rural areas in our state. And so the question is, how do you bring businesses together with government leadership to address what's needed in one part of your state may be different than what's needed in a different part of your state. And I think that's extremely important. That's why I think it's really important to have this assessment of where is the authentic right to win for each part of your state. And that requires your business leadership, your private sector, your NGOs, your universities, your community colleges coming together. And I'll say it again, you as governors are the unique capability of convening those groups and sitting and saying, where do we have an authentic right to win? Whether it's brewing or it's artificial intelligence or it's something in between, it's agriculture. And then really, how do you begin to get the resources from those various categories of business, of educational institutions, training, research, government, all working together to say we're going to have initiative to make that cluster or that sector of our economy really hum. And a significant part of that is making sure you've got a workforce that is being trained for that opportunity. In Chicago, we're working on an initiative called P33. We're really trying to figure out how do we, become a tier 1 tech city in Chicago. We have enormous assets, but they're not working together. And part of the challenge is how do you bring all these assets from national labs, universities, We train more number 2 trainer of technology students in the country come out of the Chicago area, and half of them are leaving to go to the coast. What do we do to bring, we have accelerators, we have incubators, we have all these assets. They're not working in conjunction with each other right now. So that's a challenge that we're very focused on. That's the kind of initiative that a governor could be leading. Private sector happens to be leading this effort, and the government is supporting it, but it's going to require both the private sector and public sector. That's just an example.
Well, thank you. Richard, in this country, often we see education as sort of a one and done, which really isn't working that well for many people, especially for mid-career workers. But lifelong learning is at times a hard sell. Lots of people didn't like school that much, and they're happy to be done with it. Or mid-career workers, I mean, getting additional education can be complicated. How can we both sell Americans on the idea that given that pace of technological change and the impact on their jobs and careers, they need to continue learning and relearning, and what should governors be doing to encourage this?
It's a great question. 2 things let me suggest. One is, do not underestimate the power of your voice on this issue. This is not obvious. Most of us in our brain have this image of education is something that you front load in your life. You do it until you're 16, 18, 22, what have you. And then you live off that. The image I like to use is we have the tank of gas mentality to education. We fill her up, and then we drive down the highway of life for the next 50 years. The problem is there is 0 chance, not 1% chance, 0 chance that that initial tank of gas will see us through the next 50 years. I don't care what your field is. Technology is changing too fast, the economy is, and even if you stay in the same field as a doctor, already you know every doctor has to constantly improve or make himself or herself aware of changes. So part of it is to simply make the case, what I would call topping it off. We've all got to top off our intellectual tank. I would ask that you consider making this one of your regular themes when you talk to the people in your state, to have them reimagine education. And then the other half of it, the second point, is to make it less difficult for them to do that. And Penny mentioned some of those things before. Why don't we have things like individual education accounts that are tax advantaged, that allow us at the age of 45 or 55 or whenever to maybe go get that extra course online at the community college, or take 6 months or a year. We've got to take a step backward. Got to support my family while I do it, but then I can take a step forward. Well, why can't businesses, which get all sorts of tax credits for buying and incorporating new technology, why is investment in people any less significant than investment in a new machine? Why don't we think about how we expand R&D taxes, tax advantages, credits, for the people who work for us? And then lastly, I think you as governors can have model programs to people who work for you. You can not just talk the talk, you can walk the walk. The people who work in state government, there could be training and learning opportunities that are mid-career. One of the things I liked about AT&T that they introduced is a year before a job would disappear, they would go to the work and say, because of technology or what have you, we know that your job will not exist in a year. You've been a really good worker. You're 48 years old. You've got years you've got to keep working. Let's work together on figuring out what kind of education and training you can need so when this job fades out, we can fade in another job and that you're ready for it and all that. And I think that ought to be increasingly the mentality.
Thanks, Richard. Deborah and James, you point to community colleges as really providing opportunity and a large role in connecting people who have lost economic opportunities with new ones. In what ways could we better support community colleges? What should governors be doing to kind of light a fire under our educational institutions?
So Deb and I really have the passion of converts on this issue. We've spent a lot of time living outside the U.S. We lived in China for many years, in Japan, Southeast Asia, and from there you think naturally that the great research universities are the key to American strength, and of course they are. But traveling the last 4 or 5 years, we really think that community colleges are the institution of this moment because they have the power to connect the opportunities that do exist, as you know, in all your states in skilled technical fields with people who need those opportunities. Essentially, the next generation of people whose parents worked in factories and the factories aren't there anymore, to be prepared for the new jobs that do exist in the health field and advanced manufacturing and all the other things you know on a state-by-state basis. So we really feel as if this is a theme we've tried to push, and it's important for you all too. One point I'll make before Deb giving you a specific illustration is the way we're impressed. There is a web of education. A theme from everybody here has been the connectedness of things. So we've seen revolutions in K-12 training around the country of having these very advanced career technical programs. We've seen in South Carolina, we've seen them in California, we've seen them in Georgia, and we write about those in our book. Then the community colleges themselves. I see Governor Brown here from Oregon, where Central Oregon, of course, not having a four-year university until recently. The community college there has been just indispensable. Then working with research universities, and we've seen new kinds of partnerships and companies as well. So I think that our theme has been that the community colleges are, if you had to give your next 5 educational speeches, I would suggest 4 of them being about community colleges, and the other one, the 5th, being about the connectedness of the whole web.
So here's an example of what Jim was talking about from Northeast Mississippi. There's an area called the Golden Triangle, which is Columbus, Starkville, and West Point in Mississippi. What failed there was the Sara Lee factory closed down, the blue jeans factory, the toilet seat manufacturer, and the headstone factory. There was nothing left. But the people in that area had vision, and they had land. And they went for the big plan, which was to attract, ultimately, $6 billion in new heavy industry. One of the keys to getting the industry to come to that area was the promise of a trained and trainable workforce. So they partnered with East Mississippi Community College and gave the new students, who were people who had lost their jobs or younger people who were looking for jobs, training in specifically to go into the new drone factory, into the new helicopter factory, the new truck engine factory, the high-tech steelworks, and Yokohama Tire. In that community college, they specifically geared toward training those students on the equipment and the machine tools that would be necessary to run those high-tech factories. Which they did, and they even installed kind of mini shop floors of the factories in that community college. Not everybody was going to end up with a job in those factories, but everybody who went through those programs was going to end up with those high-tech skills that would be transferable to other jobs in other places.
I'll soon open it up for questions from the governors, but before I do, for any or all of you, really, what's at stake here in how we address education and workforce training, and what happens if we don't get it right?
Well, I think the first thing is our prosperity, and the second, which is evidenced by the fact the Council on Foreign Relations, really underwrote this task force on, a skilled workforce, is ultimately our national security. Because if we don't have economic prosperity, if we have potentially political chaos, as Richard was talking about, we can't, and our competitiveness, our global competitiveness is really at stake. And frankly, competitiveness is something that has to get broken down from the national level to be more locally considered. And it evolves around, again, the specialties in your states, the specialties in your cities and rural areas, the capabilities, and why do take foreign countries? Why do those companies come here to the United States? They're looking and saying, well, I want to be closer to the customer. I want to serve that customer. But if we're not training our people, they're not going to bring their factories here, nor are we going to survive as a country, as a leading country in the world.
Now, if we don't get this right, we are going to suffer an epidemic of chronic unemployment and prolonged unemployment. And the costs of that will be immense. It's the benefits that have to go to the people who are unemployed. It's the forfeited productivity and income taxes that people who are not working, we lose in that way. There'll be a direct link to the opioid crisis that we have. So there's a resource issue. There's, I worry about the social divisiveness, because then it will trigger all sorts of debates about things. You get into this question of what the floor then needs to be for our society, and I think that will be divisive. I also think that it will soak, as I mentioned before, it'll take up a lot of bandwidth. I think in a funny sort of way, we will end up being much more isolationist if we don't get this right, because we're not going to have the resources we need to have a large role in the world, and we're not going to have the political focus we need. There will be a sense of we don't have the luxury of focusing on the rest of the world. We've got to focus here at home and taking care of our own. The problem with that is that what happens in the rest of the world will dramatically affect the fate of the American people, but we won't be able to see that through. And then lastly, it's not just, as Penny said, it's a competitiveness issue, but one of the most powerful parts of American foreign policy is the example we set. We want to be a place, the economy, the society, our political system, that others actually want to emulate. We want to see democracies and markets grow around the world. If we don't get it right here, if we can't be an example, why do we think we're going to be able to preach to others that they should adopt those policies? It will fall on deaf ears. One of the reasons, to be blunt, you said I'm a pessimist. Well, I'll just be a realist here. The fact that China's influence around the world is rising in many cases is because ours is falling. It's not that the Chinese have figured it out. I would actually make the prediction they've not figured it out, and they are going to suffer all sorts of, or experience all sorts of political, economic, demographic, environmental challenges, you name it. They have baked a lot into their cake that is going to be very difficult for them to swallow. But people are looking at what's going on here, particularly at the federal level, and they do not see something that's working, which again, I think, pushes things back on you all, that this becomes the level of American governance that people increasingly want to emulate. And in many ways, you become part then of the foreign policy conversation in ways in how others see the United States. And again, I don't think, at the end of the day, the reason we did this study, foreign policy is too important to be left to the diplomats. And I once wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. It doesn't end at home. It's not an argument for isolationism, but it begins at home. This is the base of all else. This is the base of resources. It's the example we set. It's the degree of social cohesion. And this is right now probably the biggest single threat to all of that. Because again, if we institutionalize prolonged unemployment in our country, I worry about what would be the repercussions of that.
Deb and James, what's at stake?
I will have our combined brief voice, unless you want to add to this too. So, which is, I think there's an interesting historical analogy here. Eventually, societies do adjust to any technological change. 200 years ago, almost all Americans were farmers. Only about 1% are now. We adjusted to that. But there are easier and harder ways to make the adjustment. The 1930s were a bad adjustment. The 1970s, 80s, there were lots of hardship. But the GI Bill period was a time that showed you could make an easier and more productive adjustment. So using the GI Bill period of saying we can help people make these technological transitions in a way that is better for families, better for communities, better for the nation, that's a goal we can set.
And can I add one
Please,
more point?
absolutely.
Yes. One more tiny log on the fire is training the teachers to teach all of these high-tech skills. We learned this in San Bernardino, California, that has a multi-track high-skills education high school. And they said to me that one of their most important issues right now is to find the teachers or to train up the teachers so that they are skilled not only in being good teachers, but in the specifics that they are teaching these kids.
Good point.
Thank you. Questions from any governors? Please, Governor.
I am not a state, I am a territory, but all of the things that you said, I really agree and very much apply to our island. I just wanted to hear, what do you think should be done, or how do you deal if federal policy then creates obstacle in trying to move forward with what you're trying to accomplish. For example, in Guam, our strength is our geographic location. And so we have an increased military buildup, tourism is very strong, and we are booming in construction, but we don't have the labor force to meet for the demand, and we use H-2 workers primarily from the Philippines. And the United States immigration has denied our petitions for H-2 workers, and now has recently made the announcement that the Philippines is out of the eligible countries for H-2B workers. So we have gone from 3,000 workers to now 0. So how do you deal with that, where the federal government is saying, oh, Guam, we support you in the military buildup, you know, we want to help you, give you the resources, but then creates a policy that just is an obstacle to moving forward?
I would just say two things very quickly. One is things on certain types of visas will only be solved, I'm afraid, as part of a comprehensive deal on immigration, unless you can hive off some issues. But let me try to connect it to the conversation this morning. If we don't get this issue right, I actually think it creates a political context in which it's far more difficult to tackle immigration issues. Just think about it. To the extent we have large-scale, prolonged unemployment, how much more difficult trying to get immigration reform through will be the body politic. I actually think the only chance you have to tee this issue up correctly is if we do not have a society which is suffering from prolonged large-scale unemployment. Then at least you have a chance to shape that debate. Otherwise, I think people will say, how can we even talk about opening up for more people coming in if we have millions and millions of Americans who aren't employed? And even if we have millions of open jobs like we do now that we can't fill, I still don't think you can win that debate if we have a large-scale unemployment problem.
I'm just going to put a plug in here for immigration reform and just say, you know, we're shooting ourselves in the foot right now. What I see is, and I'll take it, particularly in the technology companies sitting on the board of Microsoft, what's happening is because of our immigration policy, and this is the loss to your states, to our states, which is we're not letting in the high-skilled worker, the construction worker or the technology worker. And so what's happened is on our border, we've got Canada with a very progressive immigration policy. And so you're seeing American companies setting up American technology centers in Vancouver and Toronto. Toronto is growing at 1% a year. I would submit for, you know, Illinois or Michigan or any of these places, I mean, those are workers that are working for companies that would be here in the United States but for our immigration policy. And so, you know, I would also suggest you as governor should come together and talk about, you know, we know those high-tech jobs are very good paying jobs. There's a huge positive impact on your entire population. You know, we need a more thoughtful approach, and you all sit at the front door of that possibility being in your states or not.
Other questions? Governor Sisolak.
Is it on? Okay, there we go. I've got a question. I guess it's directed towards a comment that James and Deborah made relating to the community colleges, and I agree wholeheartedly the career technical aspect of that. How do you deal with the ability to bring in faculty that aren't your traditional faculty? They want a tradesman that's a welder, not a faculty member that necessarily has a 4-year teaching degree, but they want to be able to teach the skill that's being disseminated, whether it's welding or HVAC or plumbing or whatever. How do you overcome that licensure issue?
That is a fundamental issue we heard about all over the country. Most recently in San Bernardino, California, which I think many of you know of. I grew up right near there, where they have some of the most ambitious high schools in the entire state in this very troubled city of San Bernardino. And the main limiting factor they have now is on these high schools where it's 100% sort of free and reduced lunch for the students. They're only about 20% white, but they have 7 career academies that all students go through. is getting professionally equipped educators to go in there. And so I think this is something where governors do have more leverage than, for example, on immigration issues. You know, immigration is out of your hands, but licensure should be at least within your influence to some degree, to make it part of the bully pulpit, to work with the legislature to change it, because I assume a lot of these are state-based regulations as opposed to federal ones. So if you make this a priority, and it seems to have a lot of appeal, so I say Godspeed.
And just
Yeah.
one illustration of how important this is and why it's working at the high school level. Arroyo Valley High School in San Bernardino, in 2010, it's this high skills track high school. 2010, their graduation rate was 62%. In 2018, after these programs were up and running, it was 98%.
Secretary.
I would suggest, I would look at places like Wichita. Delaware has some good programs. Colorado, where they've changed laws so that you're able, as a teacher, to become, even though you're not credentialed, let's say, in the academic field, that you have to change basically state regulations and state laws that say, no, we can actually have, let's call it, someone who is proficient in an area become a lecturer, if you will, and it's creating new categories of what can be a teacher. For example, in Wichita, they created a position called a research scientist, which is not necessarily a professor in their university system, but allowed them to bring in people from industry who are actually doing the type of training that you're talking about, Governor. So I think it's partially to look at your own state laws and state regulations and work with your university or your community college to say, okay, what are the rules that are preventing us from bringing in that qualified trainer, if you will?
Can I just ask you a question? Which is,
go ahead.
Listening to this conversation, and I'm not an expert on this part of it, but one of the things that I keep hearing is there are success stories around the country. I don't know to what extent you've got best practices exchanges in every area we're talking about, from teacher credentialing to workforce retraining.
Yeah.
It could be on Medicare or Medicaid reform. But I would just think that to the extent there are truly up-to-date, comprehensive best practices exchanges that every governor and his or her staffs have access to, that would be fantastic.
No,
and that's something that you all could really bring about.
You bet. And I mean, our successes are often from stealing from our neighbors and others. And there is the NGA.
We try to avoid that in academia. Go ahead.
Yeah, good idea. The NGA does have a Center for Best Practices, and also fundamentally what we're doing up here today even, we both want to draw from experts, and by the end of this, we're going to be drawing from what other states are doing.
Good.
I think we have time for one last question. Governor Herbert from Utah.
Well, thank you, and thanks to the panel. We appreciate you coming to inform us on this issue. I know that it was mentioned, and I think states, by the way, to answer your question, James, I think states are being forced by the market to make allowances and adjustments. It was mentioned earlier that technology is destroying jobs. And as I look at the history, it looks like there's always been a constant state of disruption. We have moved from agriculture, as has been mentioned, James, to more urbanized areas. That seems to be happening all over the country. So disruption's been there, and education and training skills seem to be a key issue. It looks to me like this is maybe just another chapter of the same book. And so what is different about today as opposed to the disruption that happened 200 years ago or 100 years ago or 50 years ago, the Industrial Revolution, now IT and high tech? I mean, constant disruption in the marketplace. What's so different about today? Why is there such a sense of urgency today, different than what we've had in past generations?
Richard and I may have complementary views on this. Richard, you can go, and then I will have the rebuttal stage. Please, go ahead.
I think there are some important differences, but I take your intellectual point. We've gone through economic, social, technological transitions. I think this one is happening faster. I think it is not limited to any particular sector. It's repetitive jobs, it's intellectual, it's white collar, blue collar, and every other collar you can think of, so it's much broader in the society. I also think the skill levels of the jobs being displaced, what are coming on stream are far higher skill levels, so the training and education differential is significant. And I also think AI is something particularly different. It's qualitatively different in the kinds of tasks and the quality of the performance. So I think, in a funny sort of way, to see this as simply but the latest chapter of a challenge, my guess is that's probably too sanguine. I hope you're right, but my prediction is you're not. And in any case, in terms of public policy, we ought not to assume you're right. I don't think we have that luxury. I think we ought to assume this is qualitatively different and qualitatively more difficult, and in any event, different and unique, and we ought to think about what it will take people to live in a world where millions of truck driving jobs, Uber drives, and taxi drivers, those jobs are eliminated. Most repetitive industrial tasks are taken over by robots. And again, a full range of jobs from reading MRIs and X-rays to possibly what thousands and thousands of legal assistants do now in searching briefs are all taken over by AI. So I actually think the impact along the spectrum will be much greater than, say, the agriculture to manufacturing or urbanization transition you mentioned.
James.
My view concisely is closer to yours, and that this has been the story of Western economies, for hundreds of years. But I agree with Richard that the speed is unusual in this case, and that it's worth thinking about how to buffer the effects. Because again, is the GI Bill versus 1930s comparison. There are ways in which you can make for a better or worse transition, but I agree. Economic life is constant change, and the story for regions, for individuals, for families, for companies is being able to adapt to that.
There's one other thing that's qualitatively different now. It's the degree of globalization. This is not simply an American phenomenon. We are 5%, 4% of the world's people. We're now roughly 19% of the world's economy. Our share is going down. We look at the massive investments in places like China and elsewhere. We are going to be playing on a much broader field in terms of competition than we did, for example, when we were switching from an agricultural-based economy to a more manufacturing-based economy.
And I would just say the consequence of this, as I see it, is that the basic education that we're offering our population is inadequate for the fundamental jobs that are going to exist, not the most specialized jobs. I'm talking about the fundamental jobs. And the kind of skills that are being taught in our grade schools and our high schools. You talk to businesses and they will say, unless you begin that in high school, I can't, I don't want to do that in college, or it's too late for an individual to gain Kubernetes skills or things like that. So it becomes, I think we have to really rethink our entire education system. And as Richard and both Jim said, the pace is extraordinary. I mean, you talk to Bank of America, they had 315,000 employees in 2011, and today they have 200,000. And most of those jobs have been automated, and they're white-collar jobs.
Let me just say, I think most of us understand it's a global marketplace. The expansion that's taking place is, in fact, significant. That's certainly a factor. But again, I think states are in fact reacting to these pressures. I know in Utah, at least, we have lifelong learning approaches. We have more people going to college now, and particularly emphasizing technical education. One-year certificates, two-year certificates, associate degrees, more getting post-high school education, more counseling in our schools to make sure that we have alignment with what's being taught and a pathway forward for us to be not only career but college preparation. And again, realizing that the marketplace is changing and moving and dynamic, and we need to run to keep up. So I think some of those pressures you're talking about are actually happening, and I don't think Utah's alone in that. We're trying to reflect this demands that are out there, education, because that to me is the key. If you've got the skills and all those disruption and displacement of jobs, other jobs are being created because of that disruption. And we need to understand that and be in alignment with what the marketplace is allowing to happen.
To Each of you, thank you for both your thought-provoking discussions, your reactions, but also the good work that you're doing to